Power of She is USISPF's newest podcast series where we showcase the brilliance of women professionals across an eclectic mix of industry and amplify the voices of inspiring women in leadership, riveting dialogues, and candid conversations to uncover her story. We intend to go beyond the boardroom and perhaps to the virtual drawing room where we can have intimate, heartfelt conversation focused on getting to know the person beyond the persona.
My guests today, or rather guests today, are Manjeet Kripalani and Ambassador Neelam Deo, the co-founders of Gateway House. So thank you both for joining us and welcome to the Power of She.
Thanks.
We're
It's
so
great to
delighted
be on.
here.
Yeah, perfect. We've had very powerful stories on this podcast before, but I think what's powerful about both your stories is the story of both of you coming together to form a think tank, but not just any think tank. India's first think tank, if I'm not mistaken, formed exclusively by women co-founders, and one of the first major think tanks outside New Delhi. So, and one of the few in the world, if I'm not mistaken, that's been started by two women. So, I want to do the Julie Andrews School of Thought. We start at the beginning, a good place to start. How did all of this come together, your serendipitous story? So take it away.
So I'll go, Neelam, and I'll tell you the
Yes.
story of how Neelam and I met. So Neelam was the Consul General of India in New York, and I was the Edward Murrow Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And this was 2006. And she was on 64th Street and Madison, and I was on 68th Street between Park and Madison. And I would pass by the consulate every day and say to myself, I really have to meet Neelam. And we tried to connect, and she was always very busy because that was, India everywhere is here. It was Davos, India was everywhere, and was really overworked. And we finally met at Columbia University with Jagdish Bhagwati, and we became friends. And she was that distance between 68th Street and 64th Street closed. She was in a CFR. I was in the consulate very often. And at the end of the year, she was going to, one of the few diplomats that was going to retire and come to Bombay. And we thought to ourselves, well, Bombay could really do with a think tank like CFR. And why don't we give it a shot? And so we did. Neelam.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, Manjeet, we did meet at Columbia with Jagdish Bhagwati, but the second meeting we had was at a program at CFR you were conducting. Meanwhile, you had managed to fracture your leg. So the whole program was with your leg all bound up on a chair, and all of us sitting around and listening to this discussion. I'll never forget that moment.
Well, this sounds like great to go back to down memory lane, because the part that I was always interested by, Manjeet, to start with you on this is you mentioned back then there was sort of the IT boom, and India's growth story had started, and Bombay was on the rise economically, and although geopolitically nascent, and it kind of needed this kind of institute to sort of engage with both citizens of India, but more importantly, tell corporation by foreign policy is important. So when you got back to Bombay, you had this concept paper in hand and you called on businesses and companies and the ones which had over 40% exports. So one is, how did they take to the idea of think tank, and was trade or the geopolitics of trade the factor that sowed the seeds of this think tank world?
Well, we did go out with our concept note and we went to 65 companies that had large exports. And most of the time they said, oh, this is nice in America, but yahan nahi chalega. It will not work really very well in India. Acha, come on, let's come and tell me what else is going on. Come and sit down. And then something really dreadful happened, which is, it's an interesting time to talk about it, was the attacks, 2008 attacks in Mumbai. I was back in India and I just come back from actually trying to finish my book. I was on sabbatical, and that night I was very close to the Taj and the firing began. I was outside for 3 days as a reporter reporting on what happened. And the phone wouldn't stop ringing. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. People calling to say, hey, what was that thing you wanted to do? Let's talk. Because no one had heard of Lashkar-e-Taiba. Nobody knew who these Pakistani terrorists were who was coming to the Taj and destroying our city, the most international city in India. And so that's how we really got a boost. It's sad that terrorism should do it, but it gave Gateway House a leg up. And so 5 very forward-looking, progressive companies and people decided to fund us. We wanted to be independent, non-partisan, no government funding, and of course, being in Bombay. So we got to start with some very progressive people, um, most of whom stand with us even today. And that's how we began Gateway House, literally in a garage. And we were helped with the whole startup. And when Neelam got back, she'd been obviously my companion through all this. And she got back and we sat, remember, we had a pod, Neelam, of 4, and we were all squashed together in this place, which was a garage, which had hastily built sort of some pod for people to sit in. And that's how we started Gateway House.
Can I just add that, like a proper startup, we did begin in a garage and have moved on and expanded and grown and become, in many ways, very significant, because a lot of the interns that have worked with Gateway House, trained with us, have gone on to other think tanks elsewhere, especially in Delhi, which has many. But I also want to say that for me, as a diplomat just newly retired, it was a whole different experience. I had been meeting with think tanks in New York and before that in Washington and even in Copenhagen. And, you're on the other side of the table, being asked questions by, scholars, by analysts, by strategists. And now I found myself trying to answer many questions and to get the corporate representation in Mumbai interested in a whole different way of thinking and trying to understand what happens in the world and the basis on which foreign corporations also make their investment decisions, their trading decisions, and that how those should be an input into our own corporations' thinking as they expand into the rest of the world. So it was really new. It was exciting for me that instead of trying to tell people what's happening in India, how India thinks, I was now finding myself telling our corporations how the world looks at India, what's happening there, and what they should be looking at. So I thought the whole beginning part, being at the beginning, was really, really exciting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the good thing about conversation like this is, Manjeet, you fed into a couple of my next questions. But Neelam, I want to just come to you, from your time in government when you were Consul General in New York. You mentioned you used to host a Friday breakfast at the consulate for all those interested in investing in India. So how have you seen the appetite, no pun intended, change from India, from the little nibbles and the bite size to this ravenous hunger that people have, this investors have for India today?
So I would say that in the period that I was in New York, um, the US was going through a really expansive phase. They used to talk about a new Gilded Age. There was a lot of money sloshing around, and people were looking for where to go. And it was our opportunity when we had financial reforms at the end of the last century, starting 1909. And our own economy was expanding, new things were happening. IT was a huge growing sector everywhere, in the United States, of course, but also in India. People were discovering Indian talent. There was a lot of interest which should have been there earlier, but wasn't, in the importance of the financial sector. The Indian Stock Exchange, one of the oldest in the world, not just in Asia, and the sort of almost instinctive sense of trade and finance that Indian communities have always had, particularly Mumbai. Mumbai was an enormously exciting financial city. And so we were trying to sell that. And in many ways, it was pushing against an open door. American corporations, big banks, investors were looking for places where they could get good returns. And so I think the impetus of the economic reforms we had and this huge money sloshing around in New York, particularly, it came together at that moment in time.
Absolutely, and I think that's ties into my next question about Bombay as well. And as you guys rightly mentioned, Manjeet and Neelam, that Mumbai, of course, is India's financial capital, India's New York, no doubt. But it was a place which was seemed ensconced from foreign policy of Delhi, and it just seemed like a place where we had very archaic views in where people were thought business and government is business is Bombay and government is Delhi. So the viability of a think tank over here itself is very startup-ish because you push the boundaries at a time when corporations and business houses thought they don't need to know foreign policy. That's Delhi. So where was that thought process? Like to think that we could set up in Bombay and scale as you've successfully done.
In our meetings with corporates in Mumbai, it was actually quite impressive. Their knowledge of foreign policy, their knowledge of especially the American economy, and we talked a lot about that since I was coming fresh out of New York. But it needed an institution like ours to help them make the connection. And that connection required that they go beyond traditional ways of how business dealt with government in Delhi. We felt it was very important for them to go with policy recommendations which were not narrow in terms of their own company, their own firm, but much broader than that in bilateral relations, taking into account the multilateralization of trade, WTO, looking at how the jostling for international trade policies, and not only trade, but also investment, also the movement, labor, yes, but also of entrepreneurs, trained professionals. All of these are part of foreign policy and foreign economic policies, geoeconomics in one word.
And that's the good intersection of foreign policy and business, and now we see it in the geoeconomics there. Manjeet, I want to get back to what you were mentioning before because this was already part of a conversation was going to have with you. And you established Gateway House in 2009. Much has changed since then, but some things remain the same. India still has a volatile neighborhood. Given 2009, as you mentioned, was the aftermath of 26/11, one of the worst terror attacks that happened in India. And when we're speaking to you now, after the Pahalgam attacks, and of course, Operation Sindoor has been launched. So at the time of this recording, we just had Operation Sindoor. So in some ways, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
It does. It does. And in fact, this year and last year, Gateway House has spent a lot of time really focusing on the neighborhood because Neelam was Joint Secretary for our neighborhood. She always made sure that whatever people thought, Gateway House was going to keep a very close tab on our neighborhood. And she was right. We've developed a good network of Neelam through her friends in the diplomatic corps, we through our think tanks, a very good network of think tanks in our neighborhood. We also are trying to understand the changes that take place, not just vis-a-vis India, but within those countries and their own urgings themselves. And we're finding, for instance, year before last, as the shift began towards away from China, we started looking at supply chains, and as they were moving away from China, India has never been part of global trade regimes. And so we started to step in. The first really, I remember, Neelam, do you remember when we started Gateway House? Since 2010, both of us would be attending meetings for the Canadians, the Australians, all these people saying, oh, we're waiting to sign a trade agreement with India. And we'd look at each other and say, well, you've got a long way. But something changed. And in 2022, when the India-Australia trade agreement was signed, it was a two-part agreement. And for the first time, because India was established, it was a big market, you had a country that didn't say, this is what we want from you. You had a country that said, what can you give us? And that has really changed India's confidence level also. So, as you know, yesterday with Pahalgam and the attacks and everything, we signed a trade agreement with the UK.
Yeah.
Long overdue, right? Waiting for 10 years. This is a very, very big shift. So it's the India cannot really become the China plus one unless we have an ecosystem in place, and that involves the neighborhood. So coming back to the neighborhood, it is unless Sri Lanka and what Bangladesh, Pakistan's not in the game, but we were hoping that the Bay of Bengal communities now BIMSTEC, etc. That is very important to involve them in trade, and of course, trade always brings peace. So we hope and we think, um, and that is our endeavor. So this year we're focusing again. We're stepping more. We're just finishing a paper looking at the trade architecture, new trade architecture for South Asia. At the moment, with Bangladesh out of sort of commission, as it were, and only Sri Lanka there to play with us. It's in a vision document, but it's very important because there's a recognition now that maybe SARC isn't it, but BIMSTEC is. So, as a think tank, in a sense, you have to be a little bit like a journalist. You've really got to be very flexible and move. You can't just be stuck on what was in the past, and you have to be practical. So, I think being in Mumbai, and because companies and investors and the financial markets are so sensitive to the changes, we are able to pick up on some of that and move our our thinking and our study along with that. And Neelam, I mean, she always said the neighborhood is the most important for a country, and we really still believe it.
I want to add one thing to that. One of the first papers we commissioned was how our neighbors look at us.
Yes.
We got analysts from, in Maldives and Pakistan and Bangladesh, Nepal, each of our neighbors to write in and say how they perceive us. We know how we look at them, but they wrote in and it was really interesting because it also helped us then to start up another thing which was absolutely new for think tanks in India, but especially new in Mumbai, which is track two dialogues with some of our neighbors. We've just, I think, wrapped up the second edition, right, Manjeet, of track two with Indonesia. I mean, the concept of neighbors
Track
in any case
1.5.
extends from immediate neighbors and to broader neighbors. We could already see in 2009 in the contribution from a Bangladeshi analyst, journalist, very influential person, that there were reservations in their perception of India. So in the perceptions, even from Maldives. Now, these are green shoots. You have to pick them up. You have to work with them. And this is something we have continued to try to do, including through the interaction with other think tanks. Experts from Gateway House have participated in seminars that neighboring country think tanks organize. But there's also been a lot of participation in think tanks discussing energy, for instance, which is one of the big things that brings South Asian countries together, even when we have political difficulties. So I think our idea was to try also to understand and factor in how they are looking at us. What do they want? Not just what we want of, say, Maldives or Nepal or anybody.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you this, Manjeet. I mean, think tanks sort of were very 20th century in some ways. They originated in Great Britain and United States in the late 19th and 20th century, perhaps, and obviously got galvanized after World War II, and the Bretton Woods system and the Marshall Plan of rebuilding Europe. It wasn't exactly a term or a sector in the global south. Do you see the think tank industry and the burgeoning growth in India and the rise of Gateway House concurrent also with India's global stature? Because as India grows, so does the need for Indian discourse and Indian policy making and Indian intellectuals.
It's true. That we first started out. Neelam, do you remember when we would talk about the think tank? People would say, "Oh, we don't need people to think. You have to do." And it was such an alien idea. We had a little film made where we explained to people what a think tank was. No, it's not a military tank. No, it's not a fish tank. No, it was just
Totally.
people were afraid. I mean, they would mock us. Remember Neelam saying, "Oh, yeah, these two ladies from Bombay who want to do a think tank. Or go off to Delhi and do it. That's where Delhi understands. Don't bother us here." But we
Right.
entered the think tanks in Delhi too because we were fresh and young with lots of good ideas, and we put a different kind of thinking on the think tank agenda.
Yeah.
It made a Neelam would go to Delhi and people would say, "Hey Neelam, how's your thing?" And then 1 year later, they started saying, "Hey Neelam, how's your think tank?"
Mm. No,
So
absolutely.
we
And,
made
and
it successful.
yeah. And this is a more interesting question for you, Neelam. Growing up in India, our career choices weren't exactly doctor, lawyer, engineer, or think tank scholar, And in
Yeah.
some ways, when you were growing up, Neelam, you followed the path that was very revered, the civil services and being a diplomat in IFS. And that comes even today with its highest echelons of prestige and stature. In fact, my understanding of think tanks themselves came much later when I met a cousin at Brookings when I was in college. So, in some ways, there's an entire generation today, Gen Z particularly, that'll be indebted to founders like yourself for creating a whole new industry in India because this wasn't exactly a thing when I was growing up. And if you look at the people who have sort of been around in think tanks, they've had exposure to it, yourself as a diplomat, Manjeet, yourself as a journalist. So, today, people can grow up with these names as household names and know that, oh, I want to be a think tank scholar. I want to be not an academic without being in academia. So there's a whole new industry right now, thanks to people like yourselves.
Well, yeah, we are very pleased when we meet people who interned with us, whom we trained, whom we sort of enabled to be more analytical, working, including in other institutions, including outside the country, not just in India. Uh, we 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 regard all of this is the importance of thinking in a wider framework, having a context for your ideas, and that applies to everything. It applies to the setting up of a university. It applies to corporate world, of course, because globalization, even if it's not being welcomed in some forums these days, is in many ways a natural process, a process that has gone on for several hundred or maybe even thousand of years, because you find coins and artifacts from countries, as far away as Greece or Rome in India, and from India in many other parts of the
Yeah.
world. So we want that this understanding be seen, this process be understood in a global context,
Yeah.
not just seen as pure commerce or pure movement of finance or pure movement of labor, because there is no such thing as pure movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you that, Manjeet, like when you said you'd had to do a think tank 101, think tanks at a very kernel level, you can explain as the intersection between journalism and academia and policy making. But, at a time when the ideas industry is suffering globally, and some would say even you're in Washington, what's the outlook for the think tank industry? Because on one hand, there's never been a time to discuss new ideas right now at a time when with the evolution of new industries and new sectors, this is the most important time, isn't it?
It is. And I'll tell you one of the problems is that, we're not for profit, right? The tax laws in India just this year changed a little bit. So it's, if you fall under the old tax code, you can get the tax break. Otherwise, you really can't get the benefit of a
Yeah.
Section 80G, etc. This is kind of messing it up. There's no incentive now to give money because you don't get a tax break. So we're
Mm.
a little bit concerned about that. But I would say the think tanks, especially in the West, they've raised so much money. Very few are now really not-for-profit in institutions. They are intellectual institutions. They are for-profits masquerading as not-for-profits. And our friends,
Mm.
many of our friends feel that way, even in the US. They've started there's a lot of blurring of the lines, Akshobh, now that
Mm.
the consulting firms are getting into public policy, the think tanks are getting into consulting.
Yeah.
Companies are not able to decipher which is which, so they are just taking things from wherever they can. We've just had a conversation today from with one of our supporters that says there's nothing you can tell me that my public policy guy can't tell me. But
Mm.
the public policy guy isn't sitting and researching all day long. He can bring out
Mm.
the gossip and he can bring out a thought, but he hasn't been through the thought process, right? And so it's become very hard for us to keep we have to keep proving ourselves. And the consultants have become, especially in India, they have become so ensconced
Mm.
that, I mean, they have desks in ministries,
Mhm.
they have desks in companies. And this is there's starting to be a pushback because there are large amounts of money that are being spent. I think people start to understand the consultants in particular. There are almost no Indian consultants, mostly Western ones. These are all private companies. They're not listed. Nobody knows where the information goes. There's a lot of leakage of information from one lot to the next lot. This is going to have a pushback, and in the meanwhile, think tanks we have to work very, very, very hard to become relevant in this world. Then you've got social media. Everybody, if things are there, information is available, but you have to filter through it because you got to know what's right and what's wrong, what's misinformation and what's not. We have the same thing. So all of us are seeing multiple sources of information every day, including talking to people, seeing what companies write, looking at the social media, looking at mainstream, minusing this. I mean, it's just we're overwhelmed with it, but that's our job. Our job is to filter through all this and try and find the reality and give it
Yeah.
to the public.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, our job is, I feel it's even more relevant, but
Mm.
we have to just stay the course until
Mm.
the confusion sort of lifts and everything becomes sort of clear again.
Yeah. Speaking of things becoming clear again, Neelam, you had a very distinguished career in foreign service. You were the Indian ambassador across Europe and Africa, Denmark and Cote d'Ivoire, if I'm not mistaken. You were CG New York. You've served stints in Washington, Rome, and other parts of the world. So you've seen the evolution of Indian foreign policy and how the world interacts with India. And I found this very interesting when you both wrote this, saying foreign policy used to be regarded as the preserve of government and new business thinking was a domain of business school and chamber of commerce. The concept of think tank was a novelty outside Delhi and male dominated in a field. So, in some ways, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. So, the way that you've seen Indian foreign policy, it's now a way that India needs to explain India rather than the outside world looking at India and deciphering India, right?
I think, yes, there's obviously a huge change in outlook in the foreign policy establishment in the Ministry of External Affairs than when I joined. We were all pretty pakka sahib kind of idea where we had friends who were in the corporate world, but you didn't actually promote their interests even when you were abroad. I remember going to Bangkok in the 80s. That's dating me a great deal, but finding that there were already some business corporations which were quite agile and already had a presence. Aditya Birla Group, for instance, was big in Thailand already. So I think the increased interaction with an impetus from the economic reforms that came in the end 90s has made both sides more open-minded, more agile, with a much wider horizon than either side had. I think the corporates themselves have a greater understanding today. I think the foreign policy establishment certainly is much more active in promoting India's economic interests, not just commercial interests. I think we all see things in a much larger context, a much wider horizon. We also have just the time dimension. We have a much longer term perspective now, including in government, because I think for a long time people didn't understand the value, for example, of labor that migrated sort of spontaneously into the Gulf countries. But look at our relationship with the Gulf today, pushed both, pushed by the labor that goes there, by labor organizations, by corporations with interests there. And look at how close and strategic the foreign policy aspects of bilateral relations have become. So I think there's much greater synergy and synthesis in the way various institutions, including government in India, now work outside together.
Yeah.
And Neelam, also, I think that within the foreign policy, you have a lot of technocrats now joining, engineers, etc., doctors, engineers, and that makes a big difference also, helping to make
Absolutely.
it more.
Yeah,
more
absolutely right.
Yeah. Manjeet, I want to ask you, some would say Ian Bremmer sort of codified the term political risk, the intersection of business and politics and implications on the bottom line. One is, how have you seen the growth of the political risk industry in India in the last 2.5 decades, from the turn of the millennium? And since you mentioned about the public policy analogy right now, do you think that companies today better understand foreign policy beyond just political risk?
The political risk is very, very narrow here in India. They don't actually do the political risk. What is called political risk is really managing the system here, because Indian companies aren't really. For instance, we have this track 1.5 with Indonesia. A lot of Indian companies, Indonesia is a very familiar country in so many ways for centuries. There's nobody in political risk in India that is looking at political risk for Indian companies getting into Indonesia. All that work is coming to us because they're not necessarily looking at, they're kind of looking mostly at entry strategies and what are the hurdles rather than what are the risks. I mean, you're going to see some of that work coming out of Gateway House, but the risks are multiple, but the ability to overcome the risk are also now multiple. And part of it is because the world is, Asia especially has, because of the Asian tigers, and now, everyone realizes they can't really, China's done a lot to bring Asia up to a certain standard, right? They're so much more aware. And they're so much now more aware that they can really work with each other. They needn't work with either the two big powers, United States or China. They can now work. Asia is, I think, starting to learn to work with Asia itself. So these political risk analysts don't really see these movements because they're not in the same rooms as we are. So I feel that there is, apart from consultants, you're right, political risk agencies, they also use a very Western lens to look at risk. From India, from Indonesia, you need a local lens. You really have to see it the way they see it. And they don't necessarily do it. It's an imposition.
Yeah. Speaking of Western lens, Neelam, you're USISPF, you're about strengthening relations between the world's oldest and the world's largest democracy. From your time in Washington, you liaised with the whole system, like U.S. Congress, State Department, the NSC, met various other think tankers, like your future self and journalists as well. The evolution of U.S.-India relations is just one of a profound story, right? In the shortest period, this 25, 30 years or so, it went from aid to trade. It went from estrangement to engagement. We went from nuclear sanctions to civil nuclear deal, all under a decade, and a major defense partnership. And now we're talking about technology sharing. And one thing that remained consistent is India is still not a treaty ally of the United States, and it's still had good relationship with the evolution of various presidents. So if you can, talk about your time from where you saw US-India relations to where you see it now, living in the US, but as a retired diplomat. That's a fascinating story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And of course, like in any other relationship, there have been important moments when the change happened or when the change was presaged. So yes, I can tell you that in the early days in Washington, when we were liaising with the US Congress, it used to take us a lot of telephone calls and to get a meeting with a foreign policy aide in the office of a congressman or a senator. Uh, and then it would take us maybe sometimes weeks and maybe even a month to get a meeting for our ambassador to call on the senator, for example. Uh, this has changed completely. You now have a National Day reception in the Indian, hosted by the Indian ambassador, and you will have a dozen congressmen dropping in to wish us, and so it's a sea change, and the same you can see a parallel shift where we would really have to seek out meetings in the corporate sector, tell them that, we are a democracy, it's a stable democracy, all of those things. And now you don't. Now the conversation with corporations by people from the embassy, it consists of details. Okay, what about this sector? What is a better state in India where you think we should be looking to invest, depending on what the business of that corporation is? If it's climate change, where do you think we will get the best wind power? What's a good state for solar power to be installed? All these are the kind. There's been an absolute sea change, as you say, and this has a lot to do with changes in the world itself, changes in the American economy, which is the one I'm most familiar with, change, including, for instance, the deindustrialization of the United States, which they have now come to a major recognition of, with its attendant problems, but also with the benefits that they have had from that. So, yeah, big changes. The world has changed. America and India have changed. And certainly the relationship has changed from just talk about, democracy as a shared value to actually valuing what democracy brings to business in India, and how it is for us as well to promote those values in expanding into the relationship in the West, but also in the East. I mean, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that East countries in business in Indonesia or Thailand or somewhere is not also interested in having all the positives that come with law countries, rule of law countries. Everybody values stability, laws, where, if there is reform, it is going to be stable and long lasting rather than shifting.
Yeah, my penultimate question, final one for you, Manjeet, is we talk about an era of AI disrupting industry and an era of automation and companies needing to innovate to stay ahead. So where do think tanks place today in an era of AI and automation? And more importantly, how do you think tanks can innovate, to stay the platform they have been, your platform for great thinkers, great thought, great academia, great Socratic discussions?
Well, think tanks are just starting to come alive to this world of AI. I don't think anybody's alive to it yet. I mean, governments have to think about it. So the think tanks, universities, academia, everybody is just starting to understand what kind of transformation this can bring. So there are some think tanks that actually specialize in this. We still don't have in India the demand for people that understand artificial intelligence is so great that they're really in executive positions rather than thinking positions. That is going to, and in startups, that use AI. So it's going to take a little while before the academic world and think tanks can really catch up to think about how this is going to change the way the world works, how it's going to change the way countries function. How, I mean, we've seen in the wars, for instance, especially in Ukraine and Gaza, how defense uses AI and what that means. So we're seeing some of it. It's very early, but everybody's going to have to just manage it because it's upon us.
Yeah,
So it's not
absolutely.
it's not something that's we have a choice with. We just have to learn, and we have to. The biggest worry, as everybody has, is that the truth, will become a casualty. We certainly hope that it won't. And as a think tank, and Neelam will tell you, I mean, our lodestar, our star is integrity. If you don't have integrity of your scholarship, you don't have anything. So AI can come and AI can go, but for think tanks and for academics, integrity is the key. I hope that we can keep that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as Prime Minister Modi says, AI is American India. Manjeet, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I don't want to hold you up, but look forward to continue the conversation. Neelam, on a final note for you, it's actually fascinating because one of the things that we speak about on this podcast is breaking barriers, women shattering the gender gap. And one of the things think tanks have to do is fundraise. But what the sense that when you spoke about this before is even in fundraising, there seems to be an old boys club, male funders for male enterprises. So, as two female co-founders of in the think tank, how did you go about breaking those barriers and getting fundraising, which of course was a new concept for you as well in a different because when you're a career foreign service officer, you don't have to worry about that. But then in this other avatar or this reincarnated career, you have to now eat what you kill.
So yeah, it was hard. I mean, we were a novelty because we were two women who had started up this new kind of institution in Mumbai. But what did help was that Manjeet was a very respected business journalist and knew the business world and knew all the people of consequence in Mumbai. So getting meetings was not so hard, but getting them to actually extend financial support was hard. But I have to say that the respect she enjoyed as a business journalist in Mumbai, in the corporate and financial sectors, and the legal sector as well, the law institutions really helped. So I have to say I had an easier time because she was so good.
Absolutely. And just on a final note, Neelam, this has been the fantastic story of an IFS officer and a business journalist coming together to build Gateway House. You both are living a second career as think tankers, not your predominantly first choice. What's the vision look like? It's hard to read the tea leaves. It's hard to crystal ball gaze, but to put you on the spot, what does the vision look like for the next 5, 10 years or so?
I think a little bit as in the conversation you've just had with Manjeet about AI. I think artificial intelligence is taking us very quickly into a new world. Here in the United States, I can tell you that the expectation, especially in universities, is concern, some level of anxiety, that in 5 years, education, especially higher education, will have changed out of all recognition. So I think when we started a Gateway House, we came in with a lot of new ideas. We were the first to start talking about the Quad or about the politics, of the poles, Arctic, Antarctic. We were the early supporters of the New Development Bank among BRICS. We took a lot of interest in BRICS, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we have already written, if you look at our website, some really interesting things on artificial intelligence, including, and as it is so integral with social media, but we think it's going to be a bigger and bigger player in industry, in services, in all aspects of our life. So we, I think, would like an early and a quick understanding of what AI is going to do to the world, to my world, to your world, to everybody's situations.
Mm. Well, on that note, Neelam, I'm sure we're going to have continue the conversation. Thank you so much for the time, and it's been a pleasure. Pleasure is all mine. Thank you and Manjeet for joining us on Part of She, and look forward to more such interactions.
Thank you.